and thanks a lot for checking this out. I'm Hawkeye. This is episode number one, my first YouTube video about the Toronto Maple Leafs. And the question of why they haven't won a cup since 1967. Investigating that, looking through everything I can, and coming to some conclusions as to why that hasn't happened. So this is my very first video, and it's going to be starting back in 1963 at the very first NHL amateur draft. Um, now, as well, I call this Maple Leafs man advantage. I don't know, like Hawkeye says to horrors. I'm trying to get the double, triple uh, rolling letters going or something. I don't know, but sounds kind of cool. Um, but that's what this will be under that channel. All this with the Toronto Maple Leafs. But I will definitely say, and I knew this going into this, that hindsight is always 2020. When you're in the midst of doing it, yeah, there can be a number of reasons why you make the decision that you do, only to find out later if it was the correct one or not sometimes. Um, so I got that. I'm not gonna come into this screaming and yelling and blaming the people that made these decisions for some of them. Some of them they were really bad decisions that I have come across, but more about that later. Um, but in addition as well, no team as well is perfect. There's always going to be some mistakes made along the way. Um, as well. So like even the teams that had dynasties, there were definitely some mistakes they made along the way before they got there, or in the process of getting there. So I understand all of that, and I just wanted to say that as well. So, anyways, about the NHL amateur draft, it in fact wasn't the first major sport to do this. I found that football, or what would become the NFL, they had a draft dating all the way back to 1936. And basketball, or what would become the NBA, had a draft back in 1947. So that's quite a long time ago, and quite before the NHL. But I did know this. They did hold their draft before Major League Baseball did. They didn't do theirs until 1965, a couple of years after the NHL. Now, the very first NHL amateur draft was held at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, in the province of Quebec, on June the 5th, 1963. And from what I remember, Montreal is where a lot of the early drafts were held, and I do remember that Queen Elizabeth held quite a few of them, if not somewhere in the same or vicinity of like the first 20 or something like that. But I'll get through them, the drafts and everything like that, and where they were held. Now, the Leafs at the time were coached, and as well was also the general manager, and that was Punch Imlach. I might as well talk a little bit about Punch at this point, for those who may not know much about this guy. He's not really talked about much anymore in hockey, and that's fine. It's a different game, but I would definitely say he would never be able to coach like he did way back in the '60s today. That certainly wouldn't fly with the way that players are now, and the way that they were then. I think he traded his players like soldiers, and almost all the same. They weren't. I don't think one was treated any different than the other, which I would say was a mistake on his part. But what he said was the law, and he better not go against him. I do think this tactic hurt him, and of course the Leafs in the end. I mean, he was the coach and the general manager. But I'm not also saying everyone that played for him hated his guts. I think he got along well with, for example, Tim Horton. He later played for him when he was the GM of the Buffalo Sabres as well. But I know the likes of Frank Mahovlich as well as Mike Shaky Walton. I don't think they cared for his coaching or how he dealt with them. Um, they they didn't care much for the way he coached the team. Punch, he was born on March the 15th, 1918, right in Toronto, and he passed away on December the 1st, 1987, at the age of 69. It's no surprise to me that he actually first coached for the Canadian Army during World War II. After this, he also coached and was general manager for the Quebec Aces of this Quebec Senior Hockey League, and then for the Boston Bruins farm team in Springfield. Then in July of 1958, he was hired on as one of the Toronto Maple Leafs assistant general managers, along with some guy named Francis Michael Clancy, or better known as King Clancy. Um, he was a Hockey Hall of Fame member, no doubt about it. More on him and some other episodes in the future, that is for sure. But at this point, the team actually had no general manager. But in November of 58, Punch was named in that position. He was now the general manager. What he did then is he fired the coach, Billy Ray, who had only coached there the previous season and the first 20 games of the 1958-59 season. They did not make the playoffs the previous season, and he had a 26, 50, and 14 record, so not very good, really, which is too bad. It's not like I don't think he was a bad coach. There's further proof of that, as he would go on to coach the Chicago Blackhawks, sorry, from 1963 until 1977. Now, I know back then coaches, they did tend to stick with a team for long periods of time. And Billy definitely did that in Chicago. Yeah, and he certainly did have some success there, as he did finish first in the division 6 times during his tenure there. So yeah, he certainly did have much more success in Chicago. In the end, they might have been a better team than what he had in Toronto, perhaps, while he was there. Then Punch named himself as the coach of the Leafs as well. Then Punch coached the team into a fourth place finish, improving on the previous season. They made the playoffs this year. Top four teams out of the six made the playoffs, so they were in. And they were going to face the Boston Bruins. And surprise, surprise, the Toronto Maple Leafs knocked out the Boston Bruins that year. I will add that's something the Leafs have not done since that time. They've had quite a few opportunities, haven't done it since then, though. But they eliminated them in 7 games and they went on to the finals. They then lost to the Montreal Canadiens. Yeah, and then up to the point of the draft, Punch had coached the Leafs to um, 4 Stanley Cup finals. He'd been in the finals 4 times with the Leafs. He had won 2 cups. Went all the way, and that was in 1962 and 1963. So the Leafs were really rocking at this point. And by this point, Punch had a very sharp 168, 110, and 52 record. And in 52, that is ties. Back in the day, you could tie. If it was a 3-2, 3-3 tie after 6 minutes, boom, it's a tie. They did not even go to overtime. That was only for playoffs. They didn't do overtime until, was it 1985? I think somewhere in the 80s. They didn't do that in the regular season until then. So ties were okay in the regular season. So more about the draft at this point, and rules for the draft, they certainly change over time. And in the first draft, all the players were actually only 16 years of age, very young. It was instituted by the NHL president at the time, Clarence Campbell, to create an opportunity for each team to acquire a star player. So prior to the draft, NHL teams would sponsor amateur teams, and their players would then get their chance at the NHL. So those teams may, the great players may be funneled into those teams that have been sponsored. All players who are already on sponsorship lists would be ineligible for the initial draft. They wouldn't be eligible. They'd kind of already been spoken for, right? The NHL teams would then, or the NHL teams then could not talk to these drafted players that in this draft about becoming professional, giving those contracts, putting their name on the dotted line until they were 18 years of age or an adult. They then had, at that point, 72 hours to sign them or place them on their negotiating list, or they're gone. They're no longer part of your organization. They're up for grabs, if you will. So, the previous season, as I said earlier, the Leafs had won the cup, and they were first. So, therefore, they were first overall at the end of the season. Therefore, the Leafs would get the last pick in the draft. So that's number 6. There were, in fact, so few players for the draft due to the sponsorship that had existed previous to the draft. So there are only 4 rounds, not a whole lot. Yeah, so that was it in the first draft, just 4 rounds. And to go along with that, it's kind of crazy. In today's thoughts, if you will, I think every team takes every advantage they can if they have an opportunity to draft someone, they go for it. They make a pick or make a trade for somebody or another pick, something. They use that pick for their full advantage. But back in this initial draft, the Detroit Red Wings only drafted 2 people, though, so they didn't even draft 4 players. And the Chicago Blackhawks drafted only 3. So there was only 21 players that were drafted in the initial draft, and none of them made, or at this point, have made the Hockey Hall of Fame. But in saying that, there were still some very good players in this draft. So they weren't all, not good enough. There were some very good players to be had in this draft. So with the very first pick in this draft, it went to the Montreal Canadiens. And with this first overall pick, the very first pick in the NHL draft, they ended up selecting centerman Gary Monahan. He was born on October the 20th, 1946, and he was born in Barrie, Ontario. And Gary ended up being, as I said, the very first player ever drafted into the NHL. And it's unfortunate because I have seen him play, um, and he was a good player, but I think he may have been more of like a third liner. Good player. He did his job out there, but uh, in today's standards or in the standards of maybe the last 40 years, he had a very difficult time living up to the first overall selection. But he it did end up playing 3 seasons in the OHA, which would then become the OHL for the Peterborough Petes from 1964 until 1967. Over the course of the 3 seasons he played there, he played 148 games, scored 48 goals, with 80 assists for 128 points. Interesting to note, very interesting, in the 1966-67 season, his coach was Roger Nielsen. And this was his first season as the Pete's coach. He would later start his NHL career coaching for the Toronto Maple Leafs in the late 70s. It's very interesting. He was the coach that went to the semifinals with the Leafs in 1978. Gary as I said, was a good player, and he ended up playing 748 games in the NHL. He did score 116 goals with 169 assists for 285 points. I would say his best seasons were actually with the Leafs uh, in the earlier part of the 70s and the Vancouver Canucks in the mid to late 70s. So it was through the 70s his best seasons were. And then he reteamed with Nielsen in Toronto, his second stint there, for the 1978-79 season. Along with the Habs, Gary also played for the Detroit Red Wings and the LA Kings as well. Oh, yeah. So now with the Leafs during the drafts, I'm going to look into who they drafted. Um, and if there is someone drafted later that they could have taken instead of that player, say maybe somewhere after, like 4 picks after, so putting in total 5 players, including who they drafted, like was there someone in there they could have chose? I'm gonna let you know who that was. Sometimes it could be a tough decision. There's more than one. And sometimes the Leafs made the right pick. They made the right selection. So that'll be interesting, I think. Um, now, as I said, you're going to make some mistakes along the way, and you can't be perfect at the draft. And this one, I don't know, they were pretty close to perfect because they made the right choice on each of the guys they selected right in the NFL draft. But um, we're going to go through that, and it's going to be interesting who they drafted and through each draft. So, anyways, um, as I said, the Leafs had the number 6 pick in the first round. With this selection, they ended up drafting Walt McKechnie. He was the very first Leaf ever drafted, and I have seen him play, and he was a pretty good player. He was born in London, Ontario on June the 19th, 1947. And after he was drafted, he ended up playing for his hometown OHA team, the London Nationals, for 3 seasons, from 1965 through 1968. He played 95 games, scoring 26 goals, adding 74 assists for 100 points. They also grabbed 195 penalty minutes, which is kind of interesting because in the NHL he was not a goon or a rough guy, a tough guy, anything like that. He was a skilled hockey player, is what he was. So it was interesting he had so many penalty minutes back in junior. Uh, so we will get to this trade later for sure, but sadly Toronto did end up trading him. And Walt ended up starting his NHL career with the Minnesota North Stars. He did end up back in Toronto for the 1978-79 season. Gary Monahan was there as well as Roger Nielsen, as I said earlier, and the beginning of the 1979-80 season. In total, he played 95 or 955 games. He scored 214 goals with 392 assists for 606 points. Um, Interesting to note as well, he did score 20 goals 4 different times and once with the Leafs as well. Um, Sadly for Walt's sake, he did play on some bad teams during his career. When he played with the Leafs, they were a good team. They were on their way to the playoffs, but he usually, almost always, was playing on a team that wasn't making the playoffs. But he was one of the stars of the team, if you will. He was one of the point getters of some bad teams. He also played for the California Golden Seals, Boston Bruins, Detroit Red Wings on a couple different occasions, the Washington Capitals, Cleveland Barons, and the Colorado Rockies. In fact, he was in the playoffs only twice in his career, once with the Leafs. Um, but as I said, he was definitely the right guy to select in the draft. with the number 6 pick. Um, After drafting him, the problem is maybe they needed to hang on to him at the time instead of trading him away like they did. Um, Now, in the second round, with the number 12 pick, Toronto ended up drafting centerman Neil Claremont, born on May the 16th, 1947, in Parry Sound, Ontario. After he was drafted, he played for 3 seasons in the WHA from 1964 to 1967. First for the Toronto Marlboros, then to the London Nationals to play along with McKechnie as well. And then he went to the Peterborough Fleets to play with, boy, everything's going around in a circle here. Roger Nielsen and Gary Monahan with the Petes. Interesting to note, he did play with Bobby Orr when playing in Parry Sound, and they were in fact neighbors. Um, and I certainly I'm assuming became friends. Unfortunately for the Leafs, O'Neill never did end up playing an NHL game. Um, but after him, no one did either, so it's okay with this pick. They didn't miss on anybody, in my opinion, with this pick. Now, in the third round of the draft, at number 17, yeah, because somebody didn't make a selection here. Uh, Bad decision on their part. The Leafs ended up drafting defenseman Jim McKinney. Uh, he was a very good defenseman. Seen him play. Was a very good defenseman. He was born on December the 1st, 1946, in Ottawa, Ontario. After he was drafted, he played 3 seasons for the Toronto Marlboros in the OHA. There, he played 150 games, scoring 28 goals, adding 98 assists for 126 points. I would definitely say though, even though he drafted him, Punch drafted him, but I think under Punch, Jim didn't end up getting too many chances to play in Toronto. He would just play a handful of games every year, and that was it. Not many. But in the end, he did end up playing 594 games for the Leafs, scoring 81 goals, adding 246 assists for 327 points. Um, he also did end up playing 1 season for the Minnesota North Stars in 1978-79 before he retired. And he was the right pick at number 17. Now, I remember back in the day, my dad got his first HD TV, and I was helping him set it up. And once we got all set up and everything, it was on City TV, and there's Jim McKinney on this 50-inch screen right there, and I could tell it was an HD because I could see every little scar and that he got playing in the NHL there. So I knew we were in HD. It looked ugly but great, if you will. He actually worked for City TV. He did the sports. I remember that as a kid. He worked there from 1984 until 2010 before he retired. So that's interesting as well that McKinney got into doing the news after he played as well. Now, in the final round with the pick at number 21, the Leafs chose Jerry Meehan. He was born on September the 3rd, 1946, right in Toronto. He went on to play 4 seasons in the OHL, or OHA at the time, I apologize, for the Toronto Marlboros. He ended up playing 163 games, excuse me, scoring 67 goals, adding 101 assists for 168 points. Jerry played 670 games in the NHL. He scored 180 goals, added 243 assists for 423 points. His best years, though, I'd say, we're looking up, were with the Buffalo Sabres, where he actually had a career high of 31 goals in 1972-73. He was a 30 goal scorer. And also played very well for the Washington Capitals. They weren't very good then, but he played with them from the mid to late 70s. It wasn't until they got to the 80s that Capitals finally were getting over the hump and into the playoffs, if I remember correctly. He also, of course, played for the Leafs. He played for, in addition, the Philadelphia Flyers, the Vancouver Canucks, and the Atlanta Flames before they moved to Calgary. Um, After he played and everything, he was then actually GM of the Buffalo Sabres from 1986 until 1993. And he was able to get players, certainly high caliber players such as Pierre Turgeon, Alexander McGillney, and Dominic Hasek during that gig as GM of the Sabres. So he did a good job there. Now, also in this draft, he might have been the pick, maybe, was Frank's brother, Pete Mahovlich. And I wonder if he was available. He didn't even come close, but if he was available, would the Leafs have drafted him? Frank's brother, Pete. He was drafted by the Detroit Red Wings. He ended up playing 884 games, scoring 288 goals, adding 485 assists for 773 points. He also had 916 PIMs as well. He played for the Red Wings a couple times, but he probably would be best remembered for playing for the Montreal Canadiens, where he won 4 Stanley Cups, and he also played for the Pittsburgh Penguins as well. But he also had certainly a bit more of a temper on the ice than his brother Frank. He wasn't afraid to get into the odd tussle, that's for sure. So there you have it. That's the very first NHL draft back in 1963. And that was a lot of fun putting that together, looking at who they drafted. And I think I'll say it, the Leafs hit a home run in their first draft. I don't know if I'll ever say that again, but they did that. Um, so yeah, once again, just if you like this video, don't be afraid to hit like. Don't be afraid to subscribe as well. I'm hoping we get over the course of time lots of videos you can go through and you go through them like a time, like just one, two, three, four, five. Keep going and just watch them all and see how it goes. And certainly you can make any comment you want on there. Just keep it family friendly and everything like that, and that'd be great. So until next time, go Leafs go.